Greetings. This is I Am Vermont 2, and my name is Joan Moliere. I Am Vermont 2 is modeled after the I Too Am Harvard initiative. The I Am Vermont 2 photo story project shines a light on the diversity of identities and experiences of people of color all across the state of Vermont. The I Am Vermont 2 project is a medium for people of color to tell our stories and convey how racism has a significant impact in our lives. This is the first known statewide multi-generation project done only by people of color living, working, and going to school in the state. It is also a vehicle to outreach for the People of Color Caucus. Social justice activist Grace Lee Boggs said, "Creativity is the key to human liberation." A poem. Betwixt and Between by Reverend Joan Javier-Duval. One day I arrive, and I know a spirit of life is sung in harmony and fills the room, fills my heart. I know, though this is a place my ancestors never imagined, though it is far away from home, I have arrived. Betwixt, between, only sometimes seen, is this the place for me? Coffee mug in hand, the chatter surrounds me, as visitors are greeted and old friends say their hellos. The only other Asian person in the room approaches. We keep each other afloat in a sea of white, if but only for a moment. Betwixt, between, only sometimes seen, is this the place for me? From the pulpit I see them, this graying congregation. I search for their heartache. I preach to their deep longing afterwards. Hands are shaken. I am thanked. And then, where are you from? Betwixt, between, only sometimes seen, is this the place for me? Here in the farm country that is now my ancestry by marriage, a faded portrait of Hosea Ballou graces the narthex. 250 years later, I follow his footsteps, up the creaky wooden stairs, to also pronounce that God is love. The confluence is beautiful, so why is it so lonely? Betwixt, between, only sometimes seen, is this the place for me? My guest today is Reverend Joan Javier-Duval. Welcome to the program, Joan, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I first met Joan at a Black Lives Matter event several years ago. Today, we both work with the Vermont Coalition for Ethnic and Equitable Studies in Schools. So before you tell our viewers about yourself, can you share what it was like to be asked to be a guest on today's program? And if you also wanted to add when I first approached you about taking your portrait.
Well, thanks again for having me, Sean. It was such an honor to be asked, and also somewhat surprising, I think, to think about myself on being interviewed for public broadcast on TV. So often I don't, and I think we don't see the stories of people like me, like you, told in the media. And although I knew about I Am Vermont 2, the photo project, the idea of being filmed and on TV, was both an honor and also made me a bit nervous. And a little bit, I think I had that reaction of, who, me? Why me? Why share my story? What's so important about my story? Which really emphasized why it's important. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And also our viewers may not know, but you were a part of our recent and now State House 2000 19 exhibit, which will be traveling around the state, so other people will be able to see it. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How do you identify ethnically, gender, your orientation, anything you want to share?
Sure, yeah. Well, I identify as a Filipina American, originally from Chicago. I was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. And also identify as cisgender, female. I am married, so I have a spouse and a 5-year-old son, so I very much identify with my family and being a mom, having a partner, and also being a minister. You mentioned my title, Reverend, so I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. And I've lived in Montpelier for almost 5 years. And was originally came to the state by way of my husband, who I sort of, in the poem that you read, I allude to that, the kind of ancestry by marriage connection to Vermont. And my spouse is originally from Vermont, grew up in the Upper Valley. We met several years ago, and I knew from day one that he wanted to eventually move back to Vermont, had such a deep connection to his place of birth and upbringing. And it took many years and many visits to Vermont to get comfortable here, comfortable enough to begin to imagine actually living here. But like I said, now we've been here, in Montpelier for about 5 years.
Thank you. And you use the term cisgender, and we have a wide range of viewers. If you wouldn't mind explaining
what I mean. Yeah, what we mean by that. So just that the outward expression of my gender matches with my sex assigned at birth, which was female. So I present as a woman and identify as a woman. So that's what that means.
Thank you. Wonderful. Where you grew up, was there a lot of racial diversity?
There really was. I grew up on the north side of the city in Chicago, and in a very, what I would call a multi-ethnic neighborhood, especially in Chicago, by Chicago standards. So my elementary school, which I was raised Catholic, so I went to a Catholic elementary school, and it was Irish Catholics and German Catholics and Filipino Catholics and Puerto Rican Catholics and Mexican Catholics and non-Catholics, but primarily Catholic. And so, I think the diversity that was present in the Catholic Church that is seen in a lot of places was really present in my school and also in my neighborhood. That has changed a bit over time, and the neighborhood has become more gentrified, more white and slightly higher economic class. But I would say I really identified with growing up in a diverse environment. And then after elementary school, I went to a high school that was on just south of the Loop and south of downtown Chicago, which drew on a much broader geographic area, and was really the first time that I encountered folks of even more races and multiracial identity. As you probably know, and viewers might know, Chicago is pretty segregated. But in my high school experience, I really was able to interact with more Black students from the South and the West Sides who weren't as much a part of my early childhood. But that was very much the milieu that I grew up in and that I took as being the norm. So you can imagine that Vermont is quite different from that.
Yes, coming from New York City, and though I grew up in a predominantly white and Jewish neighborhood, neighborhood is the operative word, that there were Greeks, Italians, Irish, and between not only learning about other cultures through food. I mean, we didn't have any diversity classes. You went to somebody's house, you saw if they were kosher, you saw that they had 2 kitchens, and there was a adjustment period moving to Vermont. I told the story of the Black father and son from Brooklyn, who moved us to Derby Line on Main Street, and the son looked up the street and down the street. He was 23 years old on a Saturday morning, and he just said, "I die here." And I thought, as a young mother, that this would be a perfect place to raise my child, as at that time crack cocaine had come into the city. So that getting to know your neighbors, and literally a whole different way of approaching life. So tell us a little bit about your passions, your interests, what things move you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I very much identify with my vocation. It's a big part of my passion and identity, so being a Unitarian Universalist minister. But I think what brought me into the ministry speaks a lot to my own personal passions, and part of that has to do with my commitments to social justice and being involved and an engaged community member, and finding ways to contribute to the community, whether that's through equity and organizing and advocacy, which is a big part of my life, and just being engaged and in touch with neighborhoods and neighbors, and being part of a community of care is a real passion of mine and a commitment of mine. And then also just tending to the spirit and finding ways to personally connect with the heartbeat of life, and that for me is partly through nature and really grounding myself in the earth, and feeling connected to the earth. And I dabble in other things, in the arts, and I'm a very kinesthetic person, so movement is important to me, and practices like yoga and running and sitting meditation are also important to me. And really just trying to continually work on myself and my development in all aspects of my being. Yeah.
Yes, you bring to mind how many people who've been on the program are passionate about giving to the community. And I think, in a sense, that the larger white community may not see it in the ways that we see our community service and how we serve, and some of those struggles in wanting to give and dealing with some of the adverse realities that we have to navigate. So what is it like for your family living here?
Living in Vermont, yeah. It's, in a lot of ways, it's really wonderful. I mean, you mentioned, as a young mother, coming and just seeing the benefit in being in a community where you can really get to know your neighbors. And I really feel that living in Montpelier, that it's a tight-knit community that's very family-oriented and very supportive of families and children. So that's wonderful, and being able to just step outside and be in a beautiful place, and be able to take advantage of that, and have fun times together outside. So that part of things, I think, is really, really great. And to feel, I think, as a family, and my spouse and I in particular, to feel that we have outlets for our passions and our desire to give back to the community. I would say that it's a challenge, though, to thinking about being a family that is multiracial, multi-ethnic, and having a son who is multiracial and multi-ethnic, and thinking about how does the community support the ways that we want to raise him to be culturally aware and in touch with his roots and his ancestry. It's a big challenge to be in a place where it's not obviously reflected back to him, or to me, or to us, and to be also distant from my family is still very much based in Chicago and some family in California. So we have that physical separation from my family, but then also kind of a lack of representation in the community. And so that's why I'm involved with the Vermont Coalition for Ethnic and Equity Studies in Schools. And because I think that's a place where we can build some connections and cultural competency and connection to history for our children.
Absolutely. Personally dealing over 35 years in various capacities, from a parent to an advocate with Vermont schools, and not having the successful results as one would like to have from their efforts. And this coalition has not only motivated me over these years. I think the more important piece is, prior to that, was working in isolation. And being able to have such a wide, varied group of people working with and for a common purpose. You had mentioned that many tries. How long have you been living in Vermont? And your husband, you said, was from here. Has his family lived here for a while?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So we moved here about 5 years ago, and my husband's family on one side goes back 9 generations to the Barnard, Bethel, South Royalton, that area. And then on the other side of his family, I think it's maybe 6 generations. So he has, roots that go back hundreds of years. And we had, so the various places that we had lived together, mostly urban areas with a lot more cultural diversity. Over all those different moves and over the years, we would come and visit his family, who live all across the state now. And it was really eye-opening to come and visit. And often we would stay with his father, who in the later part of his life owned a house and lived in Waits River, which is just south of Barrie a bit, and is a pretty different community and environment than Montpelier. And going to Montpelier would be the trip to the big city from Waits River Village. There's a coffee shop and a movie theater, where there wasn't any of that in Waits River. And so I feel grateful to be able to know different sides of Vermont as well, and to know that there is diversity of class and lifestyle and experience, even while there isn't racial and as much racial and ethnic diversity as I'm accustomed to.
You bring up a good point about who is Vermont, who are Vermonters, and one of the things that I learned early on is how proud folks are of their lineage, how many generations they have. My first guest, when we were photographing him for the exhibit, a person passing, because it was in public, wanted to know how long did he live in Vermont? He's mixed race. And he answered, my mother's family's been here since the 1600s. And so that, maybe not in Vermont, in New England, and my grandchildren, your child, and grandchildren, if that happens, have that lineage. Mm-hmm. Moving the needle, moving the focus, moving back again, who are Vermonters in that sense, I think is an education for many people. So on that, what has been the impact of racism for you living in Vermont?
Yeah, I feel like I've really experienced that through just kind of lack of understanding and lack of cultural consciousness, really. I mentioned one of the verses in my poem refers to an incident where I was preaching at a congregation, and afterwards, someone, I've gotten this question many times, but someone kind of looked at me and said, "Now, where are you from?" And I've heard that question before, and I've got some different ways that I answer, and I think I might have said, "Well, I'm from Montpelier." "Oh, but where are you really from?" And I helped the person out, and I think and said, "Oh, I see. You're wondering maybe where my ancestors are from," and so we had that conversation, and I think that for me just reflects the kind of surprise that someone who looks like me, might show up in a mostly white space, and that kind of such a homogenous view of the world that, here I am, a brown blip in that world, and so where could I possibly have come from? That here I am, as a preacher, not just as a person, a human being existing in the same space, but as a preacher and a person of authority. So that, that happens every so often. Sometimes, someone's daring enough. Or someone trying to, from a place of trying to connect with me, might reference that one time they visited the Philippines or some factoid they know about the Philippines, which, it's a kind of simplistic way to try to connect. And little do they know that I actually born and raised in Chicago, and no, I don't speak Tagalog, and there's a lot of complicated feelings around that for me. So that's one of the ways that I've really felt kind of racism and bias show up in my life experience here.
Yeah, so in that moment, as you said, felt, how did the feeling, how did that make you feel when, I say the difference between intent and impact. So their intent possibly to connect, and the impact for you. So, in those moments, what are the feelings that come up for you?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it feels like a wall is suddenly put up, or some kind of barrier, or putting that person over there and I'm over here, and othering. That kind of happens, and also an exoticizing, sort of foreign culture, Asian, and all the stereotypes that go with that. And a lot of times it's sort of a feeling of indignation that comes up. Oh gosh, here we go again. And also real sadness. It shows up for me. And depending on how spiritually grounded and centered I'm feeling, maybe some compassion and desire to get past that and find some other way to connect. But the first response really is one of wounding. Yeah.
And in that wounding and feelings of separation, and thank you for your courage in sharing the other feelings. What do you need? What is it that you need?
Yeah. I feel like I need to really be seen for all of who I am, and accepted for all of who I am, and for there to be recognition that pain was caused. often I find that that's maybe the hardest part with folks when moments like that happen, of really being able to sit with each other in that pain and to acknowledge, wow, something hurtful just happened, and how do we acknowledge that and work through that and grow our relationship out of that.
Yes, exactly. Having someone say, oh, I didn't know, as opposed to denying or minimizing. I didn't know, and I need help. I'm sorry, and I was wrong. A lot of work, and I've said this before, I continue saying this because I'm a lifelong learner. And practicing racial literacy has been healing for me. Being grounded in cultural humility. And so not only being a lifelong learner, but critical self-reflection. As a person of color and in working with white people, how do I participate and maintain in racial hierarchy socialization? Am I able to recognize, acknowledge, and challenge the power imbalances? And I see the spectrum of people's experience there. So where people of color might be a little bit farther on the bell curve, and white folks, because of privilege and other reasons. But again, that socialization, just as I wasn't as astute to my heterosexual privilege until it was pointed out, to challenge those imbalances and be accountable. Another word of accountability for me is love. Cornel West said, justice, social justice is public love. And those are the efforts and veins that I see have been more effective in bringing both sides to the table, being able to have the tools to deal with the racial stress that comes up. What barriers do you think you have put up because of racial microaggressions, if you've put up any?
Yeah, I find that there are few spaces in which I feel like I can just be completely myself because of feeling like maybe I'll be misunderstood or there is a need to assimilate into a certain situation, and so I just make myself less vulnerable, or put certain parts of my experience or needs that I might have to the side in order to accommodate other people's comfort. And that I really feel like this is something. I was about to say a skill, but perhaps tool is a better word. A tool I've developed over time, being able to read a situation and read a room, right? Count how many brown or black people do I see? Am I the only one? And so how might I need to comport myself that's different than if I were in a space that was more diverse, more racially diverse? And so I find that it's both a survival mechanism and a barrier. There's a way in which I have to put certain parts of my identity to the side to not rock the boat or to fit in just enough, and to accommodate and assimilate, to be able to navigate whatever situation it might be, and to feel safe for myself.
Safety has been a familiar thread that the difference of being with people of color and not and the treasure of having the People of Color Caucus retreat and have that connection. Vermont is very big on building community, putting together community efforts. And for some of us, that sounds a little bit like colonialism. What is it? Community. Who, what, where. Looking more at building relationships. Out of that, community happens. And so for our white neighbors, what are the things that they need to do? What are the skills? And as you talked about being able to read a situation, Howard Stevenson, in his book Promoting Racial Literacy in Our Schools, says being able to not only read the situation, but to develop techniques so that you can put yourself in a sound state of mind in order to recast the situation. Working towards resolution, being able to navigate the racial stress, to interrupt, to be, I say, do interventions on the trauma that we experience. To our viewers, if you could have a suggestion, a proposal of what the community could do, or relations, one-on-one, or relations with organizations could do to make your life where you are more visible, where your experiences are validated and your contributions to the community are valued.
The word that really came to mind right away was invitation. And I think a lot of spaces in Vermont tout themselves as being welcoming, right? We welcome all sorts of people, all types. No one is left out. But often I think that welcome doesn't always come with an actual invitation. And being skillful at inviting folks in, particularly those who aren't being invited in, who are being excluded, whether purposefully being excluded or unintentionally being excluded, but being able to notice who's not here, who's not part of the conversation, or who might I not be in conversation with personally, and to extend an invitation. And I think, though, in extending invitation, there's also some skill that's needed there in knowing how to invite someone into relationship or into conversation that isn't about getting your own agenda accomplished, that isn't about racking up your own, cultural literacy points, but it's truly about learning and opening yourself up to another person's experience, and being okay with what they might share that might be very different from what you're expecting, from your own experience. And so that open invitation, whether that might be at some large community gathering or just personally one-on-one, being able to sit down was finding a way to invite someone into relationship in a very open-hearted, open-minded manner.
I'd like to add to invitation, because I have been invited and they thought they were welcoming, but were they prepared? And as you had answered the last question about safety, so when we invite children to events, we make sure that it's safe. We have universal accessibility because as we invite people in, we want to make it safe. We've been talking about microaggressions, which does not make it safe. I would invite to accompany inviting people in of what they need to feel safe. And it may be a process. It may be gaining those tools. It may be, I would say, a plethora. Part of white supremacy culture, it's one thing, one size fits all, and we're not. Popular education teaches us that those who have been most affected. I say today, my child continues, and my grandchildren continue to be one of my most influential teachers. And the invitation might also include, I might need to make a change. Maybe some of my language, some of my thoughts might not make it that safe place. And what tools do I need to make that? You know, many of us who are in various social justice spaces will you ouch, or, you know, so we have those tools there and ways that we can expand upon it. Are there any last gems or kernels of truth or something you'd like to leave our viewers with?
Well, I really appreciate that addition to the invitation and making it feel even more robust, because I think you're absolutely right. An invitation without also taking a look at, well, what is the container, what is the space into which I'm inviting someone, and might that need some adapting? Might I need some adapting to truly welcome, to be ready for receiving the person or the community that I've invited? That feels so key. You know, I just think here in Vermont, one of the things I've really experienced is that folks are really eager to minimize difference and to feel like, well, we're all the same, we're all equal, a real sense of egalitarianism. And there's a piece of that I very much value. And I think it's so important to be comfortable with difference, and to not necessarily think that differences divide us. And so, I guess I would just encourage folks to think about that, to reflect on that, and to notice how difference can actually be really enriching, and a place of real learning, and can also be a place of connection.
Celebrate difference. I'd like to thank you again, Joan, for being my guest and for sharing your poem and your experience.
You're welcome.
And thank you, viewers, for watching. I Am Vermont 2. Like us on Facebook.